I came home on a Tuesday afternoon and realized somebody had stolen part of my property. Not vandalized it, not damaged it, stolen it. And 3 weeks later, I was standing on my front porch watching an entire neighborhood lose the entrance they were so proud of. Now, before anybody jumps to conclusions, no, I didn't lose my temper. I didn't threaten anybody. I didn't even raise my voice. That's what seemed to bother them the most. My name is Wyatt Mercer, and until all this happened, I lived a pretty quiet life on the edge of a town called Ashwood Ridge. My house sat on a little over 3 acres of land that had been in my family since the early 90s. It wasn't fancy. No stone pillars. No gati driveway. No magasimborti landscaping. Just a white farmhouse, a red metal workshop, a couple old oak trees, and enough peace and quiet to make me forget the rest of the world existed. My father bought that property when I was 10 years old. I still remembered helping him build the eastern fence line one summer when the heat was so bad we had to take breaks every 20 minutes. Back then, I hated every second of it. Funny how those become the memories you treasure later. About 6 years ago, a developer bought hundreds of acres of pasture land next to us and built a planned community called Silver Creek Estates. You know the type. Perfect sidewalks, perfect lawns, perfect newsletters reminding people exactly how perfect everything was supposed to be. To be fair, most of the residents were decent people. I didn't have any problem with them. The only issue was that the community board seemed to think they were managing a small kingdom instead of a neighborhood. Still, none of that affected me. I wasn't part of their association. I paid my county taxes, maintained my own property, and mostly kept to myself, at least until that Tuesday. I had spent the weekend helping my younger brother move into a new place about 3 hours away. By the time I got home, I was tired, dusty, and thinking more about dinner than anything else. As I turned into my driveway, something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just enough to make the back of my neck tighten. My mailbox looked closer to the road. The row of shrubs near the corner seemed compressed somehow. I slowed the truck, pulled forward, and then I saw it. My fence wasn't where it was supposed to be. For a second, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong angle. Then I got out, walked closer, and felt my stomach drop. The original fence was gone. In its place stood brand new wooden posts sunk into fresh concrete, clean lumber, new hardware. Everything looked professionally installed, and every single foot of it sat farther inside my property. Someone had moved my fence, not repaired it, not replaced it, moved it. I walked the entire length in complete silence. The old fence boards had been stacked neatly on my side of the property. That part almost made me laugh. It felt like somebody had robbed my house and left a thank you note. Halfway down the line, I found a small plastic sign attached to one of the posts. Property boundary updated according to revised development survey. For questions, contact Silver Creek Community Board. I must have read that sign 5 times. Not because I didn't understand it, because I couldn't believe somebody had actually written it. I stood there staring across the road toward the entrance of Silver Creek. Big stone monument, decorative lighting, landscape flower beds, the kind of entrance designed to make people feel like they were driving into something exclusive. And suddenly I had a feeling, not proof, just a feeling. The kind you get when pieces start fitting together before you've seen the full picture. That evening I dug out every property document I owned. Old surveys, tax statements, closing paperwork, anything that might explain what happened. Nothing did. According to every document I had, my boundary was exactly where it had always been. The next morning, I drove to the Silver Creek office. The woman at the front desk smiled when I walked in. The kind of smile people wear when they've already been warned you're coming. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "Mr. Caldwell is expecting you." That told me everything. Ethan Caldwell stepped out of his office a moment later. Mid-40s, expensive watch, perfect haircut, the kind of guy who always sounded like he was running for office. He offered his hand. I looked at it, then looked back at him. "I'm guessing this is about the fence," he said. I nodded. "You moved it." His smile never changed. We corrected an outdated boundary discrepancy based on a certified survey. There it was. That corporate language. The kind that sounds reasonable until you realize what it actually means. I looked him directly in the eye. 6 feet isn't a discrepancy. For the first time, his smile tightened. Just slightly. And that's when I knew this wasn't a mistake. This was a decision. One somebody thought I would quietly accept. Well, I didn't know yet was that the biggest mistake they made wasn't moving my fence. It was assuming they understood where their own neighborhood entrance was sitting. And 3 days later, I was about to discover something that would change the entire fight. The funny thing about land disputes is that most people imagine dramatic courtroom battles and screaming matches across property lines. The reality is usually much quieter. A map, a survey, a signature. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. The morning after my conversation with Ethan Caldwell, I drove down to the county records office. If you've never spent time in one of those places, imagine a building where excitement goes to die. Rows of filing cabinets, old maps, the smell of paper and coffee that had probably been sitting on a burner since sunrise. I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, I just wanted confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. A woman named Denise helped me. She looked like she'd worked there forever. The kind of person who knew exactly where every document in the building was hiding. I explained the situation. She raised one eyebrow. They moved a fence based on their own survey. That's what they claim. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she gave me a look that told me she had already formed an opinion. Let's see what the records say. An hour later, we were sitting in front of a large monitor comparing historical property maps, the original survey, the subdivision development plans, tax records, aerial photographs. And that's when I saw it. My boundary line hadn't moved. Not 1 inch. Every official record matched. Every filing matched. Every tax document matched. The only thing that had changed was the survey commissioned by Silver Creek. Then Denise zoomed in. A little triangle appeared near the entrance monument. I leaned closer. What am I looking at? She pointed. Your corner. I frowned. No, that's their entrance. She shook her head. No, that's your corner. And just like that, everything changed. The massive stone entrance to Silver Creek wasn't entirely on Silver Creek property. Part of it was sitting on mine. Not 6 feet. Not 8 feet. Nearly 14 feet at its widest point. I stared at the screen. Then stared again. The decorative stone wall. The landscaping. Part of the entrance lighting system. All of it crossed onto my parcel. Denise clicked through another file. No easement. Another file. No recorded agreement. Another. Nothing. I sat back in my chair. Suddenly a memory surfaced. About 7 years earlier, shortly before construction began, the original developer had stopped by my father's house. I remembered because I happened to be there. Dad had coffee brewing. The developer had blueprints spread across the kitchen table. There had been a conversation about making the neighborhood entrance look more attractive. A slight curve. A better visual angle from the road. Nothing major. Just a few feet. My father had listened, shrugged, and said something that sounded perfectly reasonable at the time. As long as nobody causes trouble. That was it. No contract. No paperwork. No lawyers. Just a handshake. Back when people still thought handshakes meant something. I left the county office carrying copies of everything. By the time I got home, I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me. You'd think discovering somebody tried to take part of your property would make you furious. Instead, I felt calm. Because for the first time since this started, I knew exactly where I stood. And more importantly, I knew where they stood. The next call I made was to an attorney named Russell Hayes. A friend had recommended him years earlier after a property dispute involving a drainage easement. Russell wasn't flashy. His office sat above an old hardware store downtown. The waiting room still had magazines from 2 years ago. But the man knew land law. I handed him the documents. He spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing everything without saying much. Finally, he leaned back. Well, that was all he said at first. Just well. I laughed. Good well or bad well. Depends on which side you're on. I liked him immediately. He tapped the survey. They can't legally move a recognized boundary marker because they hired someone willing to draw a different line. That's what I thought. And this entrance monument, he flipped another page, is a bigger problem. For them. He smiled. Very much for them. I asked the question that had been sitting in my head since leaving the county office. What happens if I tell them to remove it? Russell folded his hands. They either remove it voluntarily, negotiate an easement, or fight you in court. And if they ignore me, then eventually you can remove the encroachment yourself, provided every legal step is documented. There was a long pause. Then he added something that stuck with me. Most people think property law is about ownership. It isn't. It's about permission. I drove home thinking about that sentence. Permission. That's really what this whole thing was about. They hadn't asked. They hadn't discussed. They hadn't negotiated. They had simply decided. That afternoon, Russell drafted a formal notice. Simple. Professional. No threats. No drama. Just facts. The letter revoked any implied permission for structures occupying my land and requested immediate discussions regarding the unauthorized encroachment. We filed it, recorded it, and sent copies to the community board. 3 hours later, my phone rang. Ethan. I almost admired how fast he called. Almost. Wyatt. His voice sounded different, less confident. I received your notice. I'm sure you did. This seems unnecessary. There was that word. Unnecessary. The same tone people use when consequences arrive unexpectedly. You moved my fence. We acted on a survey. You acted without permission. A pause. Longer this time. The entrance has existed for years. My property has existed longer. His voice tightened. You're creating a problem for hundreds of homeowners. I stared out the kitchen window toward the road. No, Ethan. You created it when you touched something that wasn't yours. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed. What do you want? That question told me everything. Because for the first time, he wasn't talking like a president. He was talking like a man trying to solve a problem. I answered honestly. My fence returned to its original location. Anything else? Respect would be a good start. The call ended shortly afterward. 3 days passed. Then 4. Then 5. No proposal. No apology. No action. Just silence. Apparently, the board believed I would eventually back down. Maybe they thought the process would be too expensive. Maybe they thought I was bluffing. Maybe they had spent so many years getting their way that they forgot some people don't scare easily. On the 6th morning, I hired a licensed removal contractor. Not a demolition crew. A removal contractor. That's an important distinction. I wasn't interested in destroying anything. I intended to remove structures sitting on my property. Legally. Professionally. Carefully. The contractor reviewed every document. Every survey. Every notice. Then he looked at me. You sure about this? I looked toward the entrance monument visible from the road. The stone walls. The lights. The fountains. The landscaping. Everything that had become the public face of Silver Creek. Then I remembered standing beside my misplaced fence. I remembered Ethan talking about visual harmony while standing on land that didn't belong to him. And I smiled. Yeah, I said, I'm sure. The equipment was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning. And what happened that day would turn a quiet property dispute into something the entire town would be talking about before sunset. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cool. The kind of fall morning where the air feels sharp enough to wake you up before coffee ever could. I was standing on my porch when the first truck rolled in. Then another. Then a third. No sirens. No shouting. No drama. Just workers in safety vests carrying clipboards and paperwork. Honestly, that was probably the most frustrating part for the board. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was calm. By 7:30, equipment was positioned near the entrance monument. The foreman reviewed the surveys one final time. Property markers had been flagged. Measurements confirmed. Boundaries verified. There was no confusion about what belonged where. At 8:12, Ethan Caldwell came flying into the entrance in a black SUV. I could hear gravel spraying before I even saw the vehicle. He climbed out looking like he had dressed while running. His tie was crooked. His expression wasn't. He was furious. What the hell is this? He demanded. I handed him a copy of the recorded notice. The same notice he'd already received. The same notice his attorney had already reviewed. We're removing structures located on my property. His jaw tightened. You can't seriously be doing this. I looked at the monument, then back at him. You were serious when you moved my fence. For a second, I thought he might actually lose his temper. Instead, he took a breath, then another. Try to stay in control. The workers didn't wait. The first stone sections began coming down. Carefully, methodically. Each piece was lifted and placed onto pallets. The decorative lights were disconnected. The irrigation lines were capped. The landscaping shrubs were dug up intact. Nothing was destroyed. That distinction mattered. I wasn't vandalizing anything. I was reclaiming space. And somehow that made it even harder for them to argue. By 9 o'clock, residents had started gathering. People stood on sidewalks. Parked golf carts nearby. Whispered among themselves. Phones appeared. Pictures were taken. Videos started spreading online. I overheard one woman ask if a neighborhood was being sued. Another thought the county had ordered demolition. Nobody seemed entirely sure what was happening, which was ironic, because the people running the community had spent days refusing to explain it. Around noon, the fountain was shut off. For years, that little waterfall had been one of Silver Creek's signature features. The sound echoed through the entrance day and night. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence felt strange, like watching a clock stop ticking after you've heard it for years. By late afternoon, the transformation was impossible to ignore. The grand entrance was gone. The decorative wall was gone. The landscaping was gone. The fountain was gone. What remained was simply a road connecting a neighborhood to the county highway. Nothing more, nothing less. As the last truck pulled away, Ethan stood staring at the empty space. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked uncertain. Not angry, not arrogant, just uncertain. The next 48 hours were absolute chaos. Delivery drivers missed the entrance. Visitors drove past. Online neighborhood groups exploded with rumors. Residents demanded answers. Board meetings filled up. People started asking uncomfortable questions. Questions that should have been asked before somebody moved my fence. Then the phone calls started. Not from attorneys. Not from board members. From residents. Most weren't hostile. They were confused. A retired teacher stopped by one afternoon. A young couple came by the following day. An Army veteran who lived near the back of the neighborhood knocked on my door carrying a six-pack and 1,000 questions. I invited them in, showed them the maps, the surveys, the records, the notices. Every single person had the same reaction. Nobody had been told the full story. They had been told there was a disagreement. They hadn't been told the entrance sat on my land. They hadn't been told the board moved my fence first. And once people learned that part, opinions started changing quickly. 3 days later, the board requested a meeting. Not at their office. At my workshop. I found that interesting. Very interesting. Because people who believe they hold power usually insist on meeting in their territory. When they show up at yours, something has changed. Ethan arrived with 2 board members and their attorney. The atmosphere felt completely different from our first conversation. The confidence was gone. The rehearsed talking points were gone. Reality had entered the room. Their attorney spoke first. We reviewed the historical records. I nodded, and he glanced toward Ethan. The original boundary appears to be exactly as you've stated. There it was. Simple, direct, no corporate language, no visual harmony. No devaiste interpretación. Just the truth. I let the silence sit for a few seconds. Then I asked the obvious question. And the entrance? The attorney cleared his throat. It partially encroaches on your property. I couldn't help smiling. 14 feet isn't what I'd call partial. Nobody laughed. Negotiations lasted nearly 3 hours. They wanted an easement. I wanted accountability. Eventually, we reached terms. The community would restore my fence entirely at their expense. The board would formally acknowledge the boundary error. A permanent easement would be recorded legally through the county. Compensation would be paid for the use of that section of frontage. And any future modifications would require written approval. This time, everything would exist on paper, exactly where it should have from the beginning. A week later, the agreement was signed. 2 weeks after that construction began. The new entrance looked very different. Smaller, simpler, farther back. No dramatic curve crossing onto my property. No creative landscaping creeping over boundaries. No assumptions. Just a clearly defined structure sitting exactly where it belonged. Funny enough, I actually liked it better. So did a lot of residents. It looked honest. The day my replacement fence was completed, I stood watching the final post go into the ground. The contractor packed up. The workers left. And a few minutes later, Ethan walked over. Just him. No attorney. No board members. No audience. For a while, we simply stood there looking at the fence. Finally, he spoke. You know, this never had to become such a mess. I almost laughed, because for once we agreed. You're right, I said. It didn't. He looked at me, then nodded slowly. There wasn't really anything else to say. Some lessons arrive cheap. Others arrive expensive. Silver Creek learned there's the expensive way. These days, things are quiet again. People wave when they drive past. A few residents have become friends. The veteran still drops by every couple of months. And every evening when the lights come on at that rebuilt entrance, I notice something most people never will. I know exactly where it sits. I know exactly why it's there. And I know that this time it exists because two sides reached an agreement instead of one side making an assumption. Maybe that's the real lesson. The fight was never about 6 feet of land. It was about respect. Because the moment people start believing they can take something simply because it would be more convenient, the problem isn't property anymore. It's entitlement. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have handled it differently? Should I have given them more time before removing the entrance? Or was reclaiming my property the only way to make them take the situation seriously? Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or somebody who thought the rules applied differently to them, share your story too. Sometimes the most interesting part of these situations isn't what happened. It's what people think should have happened.